This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. A repeat guest today, Ben Hunt of Epsilon Theory fame. If you've not seen Ben's writing, you must have been living under a rock for the last handful of years. He comes at the subject of Wall Street, money, finance, trading, markets from a different perspective. He does definitely get me to think. Today we discuss one of his most recent articles, the MacGuffin. Now, to find out what that is, you will have to listen. So please, sit back and enjoy Ben Hunt's perspective on the MacGuffin. Hint, it's about Bitcoin, it's about crypto. Please enjoy this conversation. Ben, I caught this piece from you. I think it's called The MacGuffin, Part 1. We're going to dive into this, and I think it's going to open up into all kinds of other areas. Before jumping into that, I want to see if we can find a common ground on perhaps everything since 1999. Let me sum it up this way from my perspective. NASDAQ goes up 100% in 1999. We get the dot-com crash in early 2000. NASDAQ bottoms out minus 77%, fall of 2002. We all saw The Big Short. We know what happens next. We then get to the March of 2009. Something mysterious happened behind the scenes, and all of a sudden stocks went up. Then we get to March of 2020, and then we've got COVID. The Fed did some stuff, and stocks went up. Now, here we are in 2022. Is that a fair assessment?
Every war is different. Everyone fights the last war. I think there's meaningful differences, the underlying causes and directions and actions for each of those events that you described.
Do you feel like there's a thread through those events?
I do. I think that there's a thread, frankly, through all of markets up and down. I think that thread, I think where we're going at it, has become more of a rope today. I think that the thread, which is of a constructed nature to drive so much of investor behavior, I think that that thread is becoming more prominent. I think it's becoming more impactful. If that's where you're going with this, I can certainly agree.
I just wanted to kind of lay a foundation. I was thinking before we even dive into the MacGuffin, which I want to go to now, I think most people would probably say, even though I didn't talk about the causes and whatnot, most people would probably say that's a fair description as to what's gone on in the last 23 years. And the Fed has been there taking assorted actions for good or bad. And people have arguments about whether it was right or wrong and all that kind of stuff. But I just kind of want to lay a foundation. Let me let you jump in, though, because, again, the main topic here is to go into the MacGuffin Part 1. Why don't I let you outline your perspective?
That word, that phrase, the MacGuffin, was something that Alfred Hitchcock famously described in the 1940s. People were asking him about his movies, how he defined the MacGuffin. And apparently this comes from some old Scottish joke or something like that, which I've never quite understood. But the MacGuffin, a MacGuffin in Hollywood, is the object of desire, the object of desire. As Hitchcock explained in the 40s, this was at the core of whatever movies he made. There had to be this object of desire. If he was making a spy movie, then the MacGuffin was the papers or the secret file. If you were making a heist movie, the MacGuffin would be the jewels or the gold. It didn't really matter what the MacGuffin was. The MacGuffin was simply an empty shell around which an entire plot was created to entertain or engage or scare or amuse the viewer. That word, the MacGuffin, is now part of Hollywood script writing. And more broadly, Hollywood, really almost all scripted television programs as well, they follow a very set structure. It's a 3-act play. There's these phrases, they call it rising action, they call it declining action, plot points, plot twists, and MacGuffin, which gets introduced typically midway through Act 1, revealed again towards the end of Act 2, towards the conclusion. The amazing thing is you can Google any movie you've ever enjoyed or not enjoyed, any movie you've ever seen, plus 3-act structure, and you can see a visual representation of the 3-act structure, the similarities between movies, the introduction and the resolution of the MacGuffin. It's phenomenal. Every movie you've ever seen has this 3-act structure. Most movies you've seen have a MacGuffin as this object of desire that's placed in very specific points. I was looking at this, the thread, as we were talking about earlier, is that in the same way that Hollywood uses this very formalized structure to get us to enjoy a movie, they do it because it works, because we are literally hardwired, neurally hardwired to respond positively to these 3-act structures. We're neurally hardwired to recognize and appreciate an object of desire and understand the motivations of the characters and the plot around that object of desire. Hollywood does this and does it so well to get us to buy a movie ticket. Wall Street does it equally well.
Maybe better.
Maybe better. They do it to garner our fruits of our labor, our wealth. It's a phenomenal machine that Wall Street has built. And once you start looking at this machine in the same way that you would look at Hollywood, where there is the conscious use of very well-defined narrative structures, scripts, story arcs, plots that are developed around a MacGuffin, it's pretty eye-opening, Mike. I got to tell you, you start seeing it everywhere once you start looking for it.
I guess you'll probably give me a pat on the back for this. I had no idea what Terra Luna was until it imploded. I'm proud of myself for that I did not waste 1 ounce of my effort knowing about it, that it even existed. However, as somebody who is in this world, it's interesting to know about. I guess for me, I immediately thought back to, okay, the sock puppet and pets.com and some of these .com creations of the late 90s actually stayed around for a little while. At least Terra Luna really showed that some of these new inventions that have sprung up can go away really fast.
I don't think that crypto more broadly, and I'm including Bitcoin within that crypto description, I don't think it's going away. I really don't.
I meant some of the players, some of the pink sheet penny stock guys, yeah.
But I'm agreeing with you. What I mean by this is that what really struck me was that when I talk about a MacGuffin, when I talk about a narrative, we call them a narrative archetype, you can think of it as like a story arc or a script. It's not limited to the pets.com. It's not limited to the Terra Luna crypto world. Those are phenomenal examples of it for when a MacGuffin is revealed to be, oh, there's no there. It was just a story. It was just an idea. Those are wonderfully powerful and instructive examples of the MacGuffin 3-act play structure. I want to encourage everyone to think of, frankly, everything you see, you interact with in capital markets, and this includes private markets as well, as something that's being sold to you on the basis of a script that you can recognize, you can see. Look, it doesn't mean you don't want to make investments. The point is that everything that is sold to you, and when I say Wall Street, I'm speaking very broadly about the business of financial services. Everything that is being sold to you is being presented to you through a script, through a structure, a narrative structure that is designed to make you nod your head and go, huh, that's interesting. Yeah, I see that. That's the big point here, but it is exactly with the Terra Lunas and the pets.com of the world that is revealed, I think, and makes it possible to see those patterns and look to protect yourself from them.
As we look at something like this, Terra Luna implode, and I'm sure, let's just be honest and use the term that many people, and I'll give the caveat here, many people, including some people that are Bitcoin only people that would call these types of products shit coins is the common term. I had a guy on my podcast recently, a guy named Jim Cullen out of New York City, running a big value fund. And Jim said, well, we had the pink sheets back in the 60s. We've seen the Wolf of Wall Street and DiCaprio and selling penny stocks and all that kind of stuff. This is not uncommon for, I don't want to say each generation, but perhaps that's a good way to say it, for each generation to kind of have their moment of where they can get rich for doing nothing.
That's absolutely right. And yet, what I would suggest is that value is a story, is a script. Growth is a story, is a script.
Trend following is a script.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That doesn't mean that there's not
efficacy there.
It's a great word. I was going to say truth in the stories, but I think it's so important for us to recognize that we are all neurally hardwired. We can't help ourselves but to respond positively to stories that are presented to us in a certain way. What I think that you and I and all of your listeners can agree is that if we listen long enough, if you leave yourself open to being told stories long enough, you will hear a story that you like. This is what, again, the business of financial services, the business of Wall Street is really good at. Oh, you didn't like that script? That didn't grab you? Here's another. Here's one. We are immersed. We are constantly being told these stories. So long as we're paying attention to the story, we're going to find one that we like and it'll get us to buy.
If we fell in love with the story of holding on to Amazon starting in 1999 or holding on to Apple starting in 1990, those would have been good stories to listen to.
Sure.
They worked out, is all I mean.
They worked. They absolutely worked. And here's where I'm going to, I think, describe the antidote to story or another aspect of how we are neurally hardwired. And for this, it's called, the name that this described to this is Gell-Mann amnesia, after Murray Gell-Mann. He was the discoverer of the quark, a physicist. The story comes, this phenomenon comes from Michael Crichton, who was, if you remember, Michael Crichton was the guy who, he first wrote the Andromeda Strain. He wrote Jurassic Park. He wrote Westworld. Michael Crichton really invented the techno-thriller genre of books, first of all, and then he went to Hollywood and he made all these movies. Crichton was talking to a group as he was describing it. He said, I'm often perplexed by what gets published in the LA Hollywood newspapers, because I'll read something that I know a lot about, and I'll just be flummoxed at how wrong the story is, at how poorly the reporter understood the facts of how and why this movie was made. They'll even get causality wrong. The article, this is the phrase that Crichton used, I call them wet streets cause the rain stories. They just flip everything backwards. It's just all totally wrong. I was talking with my friend Murray Gell-Mann about this because I had just read in the New York Times this article about physics, and I was asking him about it. And Gell-Mann told me, oh my God, no, that article was completely wrong. The writers there at the Times, they got the facts wrong, they got the story wrong, everything was wrong about that article. And Crichton says, well, and that's where it hit me. I'll read an article about something that I know a lot about, Hollywood making movies, and then I'll turn the page and I'll read another article about something I don't know a lot about. And I'll look at it and I'll go, huh, that's interesting. That makes sense. And that's what he got at, because he realized that when he read this article about physics, it was exactly the same thing, that someone who really knew about it read that article and wasn't like, huh, that's interesting. They were saying, oh my God, that's so wrong. That was Crichton's story. And I remember when I first read this from Michael Crichton, who's dead now. He gave this talk 20 years or so ago. I remember in my own life, the experiences I've had when I've read a newspaper article and it was something I knew a lot about. A Wall Street Journal article, and it was about a company that I was working for at the time. And I remember after this article came out, all of us, the company, were getting together and said, oh my God, we have to get a retraction. this article is just so wrong. It's just awful. These factual errors, we have to get this corrected. And when I've talked about that with other people, similarly read a newspaper article about something they know really well, 100% that's been our response. It's been like, oh my God, they got this article so wrong. They got everything so wrong. And yet all of us, when we turn the page, when we go browse and we read the next article in that newspaper or that news source, we nod our head and go, huh, that's interesting.
You just made an interesting point, because if people are really catching the depth of that, that's damn true. And look, I've written 6 or 7 books here now on Trend Following the topic. I've never seen a newspaper article get it right. That doesn't mean they have to say it's great or it's wonderful. I don't care about that. But just describe what the hell it is, even.
Just get it right. That is everyone's experience. And yet the amnesia part of this is that when it's not a subject with which we are extremely familiar, with which we have been personally immersed, we are prisoners to the storytelling. We nod in our heads and we go, huh, that's interesting. What I'm suggesting is that all of us, when we're thinking about our investing world, what I think is so critical is to invest our money, invest our time in those areas where we really know what we're talking about, where we have been personally immersed in this subject, and that we're not prisoners to a story. And unfortunately, I think that because of the way that the modern investment casino has been constructed, there are so few areas where we are knowledgeable, deeply knowledgeable about a subject area of investing or the business of investing. We think to be a good investor, we have to be diversified. We have to have these different asset classes. We have to have all these different securities, companies represented in our portfolio. And I think that's a story too. I think that that's a story that's been told to us because it serves the interest of the business of financial services. It makes it easier for them to tell a story that we nod our head at and go, oh, that makes sense. That's a good idea. Whereas if we were really immersed in that subject, we might do something very different because we would know it so well. And we'd be able to recognize the story from the efficacy, as you put it. The more I see, or the more I think about the role of story arcs and scripts in our world, and this is what I meant from the outset when I said I think the thread is becoming bigger, it's becoming a rope. It's not that this aspect of markets that's been with us forever is going away or is even staying the same. I think that our world is being designed so that this thread is becoming even stronger, more of a rope that becomes a noose with which we hang ourselves.
Yeah, someone's pulling on that thread. You already know this because I looked at some of the comments on the article. I don't think even people that were loaded to the gills with Terra Luna, unless they're delusional today, I think most people would share the perspective that you laid out in the MacGuffin article. I think they would be like, yeah, it's a bunch of shit coins. Obviously, Wall Street's got their claws in there. They're going to milk people as much as they can. That's what they do. Not all elements of Wall Street, but a lot of them, of course, that's what's going on. It's just become like that. Some of the pushback, the interesting part for me is kind of the investigative reporter to try and hear all sides. The pushback would be some of those folks, and I think you probably know this is coming, some of those folks that would say, you know what, I'm kind of a maximum Bitcoin. That's where I am. I don't do any of the stuff. In fact, I agree. I'm just speaking rhetorically. I agree with Ben. I think all this stuff is terrible. These people are losing their rear ends. But they might say that Ben is not getting why we only have Bitcoin and why we're sitting only on our Bitcoin. And that was kind of why I laid out the opening scenario of those various events, because I think there is a significant number of people around the world that have looked at the last 20 years of events and they feel like they don't know what's going to come next. They have this one particular decentralized crypto product, Bitcoin, that arrives for people that got in early. They've made a bloody fortune, bless them. People that have arrived late have not made a bloody fortune. They could have lost their house. Do you see or share any of this understanding that some of the Bitcoin maximalist folks would come back at you and say, yeah, we get that all these bad actors are using this one coin that we really believe in, this decentralized product. And they would point to lots of well-known folks out there, from Mark Andreessen, et cetera, all these kinds of people out there. I take people at their word, well-intentioned and whatnot. I'm not defending the shitcoin types. But you see this distinction? I would take it from your MacGuffin article. You don't see that distinction.
I absolutely see the distinction. I just don't think that it's an accurate distinction. The reason I don't think it's an accurate description is that I think that Bitcoin, OG Bitcoin, the rationale for owning Bitcoin has been marginalized, and that there are, frankly, I think quite few people today that hodl Bitcoin, the original Bitcoin, in the same way and for the same reasons that everyone hodled Bitcoin 10 years ago, 12 years ago. And what I mean by that, I want to use an example here of what happened, because I think the same thing happened with physical gold and the introduction of gold ETFs, particularly GLD. What I think has happened to Bitcoin, the Wall Streetification of Bitcoin, I call the securitization of Bitcoin. I call it Bitcoin, making the jazz hand sign right here. So usually when I write that, it's Bitcoin in italics with an exclamation mark and a trademark sign. And what I mean by that is exactly the same process and exactly what happened to gold when it became gold, jazz hands, exclamation mark, trademark, particularly with the introduction of the GLD ETF. The securitization of gold, the turning of gold into just another game at the Wall Street casino, is, I believe, exactly what has happened to Bitcoin. I'll step back a second. I admire so much that OG Bitcoin philosophy, that OG Bitcoin, it's my node, this is my keys.
It's hard not to admire.
Absolutely.
When folks really know it and explain it, which I've had it explained to me, it's hard not to admire them. And I want to say to myself, why didn't I throw $100,000 at it 10 years ago?
But that's the thing. When you say throw $100,000 at it, you're thinking in terms of, oh, I'm going to convert it back into fiat at $10 million. You're thinking in that Wall Street way. That thinking, that story arc of number go up, is exactly what drives the scripts and the structures that Wall Street has intentionally made to get you to nod your head and say, yeah, that's interesting. I like that idea of number go up. I like that idea of there's a limited supply. All the stories, this is an inflation hedge. It's all the stories that made GLD incredibly popular, to the point where very few people, and we call them now gold bugs and paranoid, actually own physical gold anymore. The meaning of gold changed when GLD was introduced. It became institutionalized. It became part of so many big portfolios. And the meaning of gold became not this is my personal, very personal insurance policy when things go really bad. But no, the meaning of gold today in the form of these securities like GLD is either there's a number go up story. I'm putting my money in this because it's a portfolio diversifier, the patterns of gold. The voice I'm using is not meant to be disparaging. That's a role, but it's different from the original meaning of gold. It's held by major institutions as an insurance policy against central bank error, as an insurance policy against central bank error. And that's a very different meaning for gold than before these Wall Street securities were presented to us. And it's exactly the same thing with Bitcoin. Bitcoin today is the funding mechanism for that entire crypto ecosystem. Terra Luna was attempting to solidify itself. They went out when Luna was worth a lot of money and bought a lot of Bitcoin. They bought a lot of Bitcoin. They didn't buy as much as they wanted to. They were trying to get up to $10 billion. If they had succeeded in getting $10 billion worth of Bitcoin, I don't think it would have collapsed. I think that would have been enough to stop the run on the bank. This idea that Bitcoin is somehow separate from the greater crypto ecosystem, I think is just demonstrably false. Not because I think the original holders wanted this to happen, not because they like that this is happening, but because this is the nature of Wall Street in the world, and it happened.
Let me interject there. Bringing up gold, bringing up hodling, I could think of some Bitcoin hodl folks that I know, very smart, and they would say, okay, yes, Ben, you are correct. This is what's happening in the ecosystem. There is shitcoins, there's fraud, there's bad exchanges. But they might say, Ben, hold on, I've got my stuff decentralized. I'm not attached to an exchange. I'm worrying about my personal security the same way somebody currently around the world might have a basement full of gold bars. What I'm ultimately getting at is the mindset. That's why at the beginning of this conversation, laying out those 20 years getting us to now, the mindset to have Bitcoin in your possession, the mindset to have physical gold in your possession, not the shit coins, not the GLD. Is that mindset wrong to have in the current environment after watching the last 20 years?
It's neither right nor wrong. I just think it's a pretty terrible way to live. What I mean by that is I've lived this. I feel it's because I do sympathize so much. I do feel like that the world can and often does go in really bad directions. But what I suspect, I've lived this and I felt this, when you are immersed in a storyline, in that story arc, that the world is going to hell and that you need to protect yourself by prepping in whatever that prep means, you find yourself rooting for, feeling vindicated by the bad things that happen in the world. Find yourself, yes, I'm being proven right that the world is declining, that my prepping will pay off. Ha ha, those other fools, they'll be left out in the cold, but I'll be sitting pretty with my disaster prepping that I've done here. My personal view is that that often leads itself into a very counterproductive way of living in the world. You find yourself, again, rooting for this script, and it makes it harder for you to participate in and, frankly, enjoy the good stuff in life. So that was kind of a meta way of describing it. I don't think it's right or wrong, and I sympathize with it entirely, but I think that it's easy to fall into that script of disaster and to start not just preparing for it, but actually actively rooting for it, because then that proves that you were right. I think that's a pitfall from going down that path. I'm not saying that listeners or anyone of you or me fall into it, but I think if we're being honest with ourselves, we have to recognize that it's as easy to fall into immersion into that story arc as it is to fall into the story arc of to the moon. In all the story arcs we see in crypto, there's the MOAS, the mother of all short squeeze story arcs that a lot of people have fallen into. It's just a miserable way to live, Mike. It just is.
Let me throw it back in the sense that if we look at, we go back in time, go back to, of course, a lot of people will say that the moment that Nixon went off the gold standard, the 73, 74 bear, gold running up in 79, the 87 stock crash, early 90s sort of recessions, etc. 94 was a rough year. Then all of a sudden, Netscape went public. We were off to the races. And of course, back to the beginning of this conversation, what I laid out, how do you view where we are in our current financial world? How do you see things? Because it feels like to me, of course, I've got this trend following mindset where I don't necessarily really try to figure out anything anymore because I don't think I can. I just kind of go with the flow, so to speak. Where do you see us in terms of, okay, you make a case and it's a persuasive case about why being a Bitcoin holder could be a rougher way to go through life. On the flip side, they might say, well, hold on, Mike, we're in a rough environment, so to speak. I guess that would be my follow-up to you is how do you see us in this current moment?
It's what I spend all my time thinking about. I'm going to answer in two ways. First of all, I'm going to answer in terms of how I interact with financial markets, my business, In my business within financial markets, I have a very similar attitude that you do, Mike, which is that I don't look at structured data, which you do for trend following strategies, but I absolutely look at, I'll call it trend following strategies using unstructured data. So I look at these narrative patterns. That's what guides me in my business of trying to understand how to navigate investing. Similar to you, I'm not trying to predict, I'm trying to react. And I think that there's an edge that one can find in trend following using structured data. And I think there's an edge that one can have in trend following in unstructured data. The first part of my answer is I'm in 1,000% agreement with you that I'm not trying to predict. I'm trying to react quickly and to go with those dominant aspects of behavior, which I absolutely believe some of it comes from structured data, some of it comes from unstructured data. That's the first part of the answer. The larger part of the answer, though, is what do I do with my life? How do I think about investing as being part of that life? For me, the answer is not to hodl anything. The answer is not to predict, oh, the S&P is going to be at XYZ at some sort of date. I'm not going to do that. Keep breaking this down to two reasons. One, I sympathize with the notion that the world is going to hell. I really do. I think a very hard rain is going to fall because of the conversion of capital markets into a casino, because of the way in which markets have been transformed into a political utility by central banks. I believe all of that. My answer then is not to find some impervious security or asset. No, my answer is to find real world actions that I can really know. I think Nassim Taleb was the first one I wrote about this, where they were talking about what's your personal investment. Well, I bought a dry cleaners. I bought a bakery. Those are absolutely the same sort of things that I think of how to think of investing in my life. What are those things that I can really know, where I'm not prisoner to nodding my head and saying, oh, yeah, that sounds right. I want to get away from that. And the only way I know to break out of Gelman amnesia, the only way I know to not allow myself to be nodding my head at a plot, a story arc that's being constructed around a MacGuffin, an object of desire, is to become really immersed in it, to make it part of my community, to make it something that I can really and truly know. And that gives me confidence that I'm not just nodding my head at a story.
When I think of Bitcoin, when I talk to folks that believe in it a lot, I would like to believe in it because, again, some of the folks that I've spoken with are very, very bright. They make a persuasive case. But I would say from a buying and holding Bitcoin versus going back to David Ricardo in the 1700s, cutting your losses and letting your profits run on. Cutting your losses and letting your profits run on seems like a much better way to kind of go through life. And again, that's more of the reaction approach. That's more of like, I don't know what's going to happen, but if something's rewarding me, I'll keep going with it. But if it's not rewarding me, I'll get out. The people that got up to Bitcoin, if they got in at, I don't know, 60 grand or something. Actually, somebody told me this. He got in at 60 and he didn't look by his age. He probably should have been buying it, but down big. He was talking about dollar cost averaging in. Then again, I know some other folks that would really say, hold on, I got in very early. I give the round of applause and I say, okay, I'm human. There's a little bit of jealousy there. But then again, how does that work in terms of store of value currency, all that kind of stuff, digital currency? There's a lot of issues going on here.
My test, if somebody starts mentioning to me price when they're talking about Bitcoin and they're talking about I've lost money or I've made money or I've got in at this price level and now it's at that price level and I'm hoping it goes to this price level in the future. If that is the conversation I'm having with someone about Bitcoin, then they're not in Bitcoin. They are in Bitcoin, exclamation mark, trademark. If your story around Bitcoin in any respect includes a number go up scenario, that's part of your thinking, then you are buying the Wall Street security of Bitcoin. You are absolutely part and parcel of this crypto ecosystem. And if you think that you're separate from what happened with Terra Luna, I'm telling you, you are just kidding yourself. That's how I think about it. And I think as you're describing it, how you're approaching it, you're thinking about it in terms of something you know a lot about, trend following.
It's another something that could be traded.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's fine. That's great. What is problematic for me and what I get anxious about, frankly, makes me angry a lot of times, is that the people who are not looking at Bitcoin as something just to be traded, but who are seeing it as an investment, that's what gets me angry, as this long-term investment. That is not the OG Bitcoin approach, is really not. It is the Wall Street story that's been told to a lot of people and is being told by a lot of people who absolutely know better. People tell you, oh, it's a store of value in an inflationary environment, and so it should be 1% of your portfolio. That's just another MacGuffin. And that's just another Hollywood plot.
How do you feel about the actions of the Fed since, let's say, when the NASDAQ bottomed out in the fall of 2002 and equity markets were on their back, the magic started, the beginning of the Big Short movie? How do you feel about the actions of the Fed over the last 20 years? How does it strike you? Because I've talked to quite a few people that are deathly afraid they're going to get it wrong. We're going to go to hell in a handbasket. And there are some very persuasive cases for that caused me to pause for a second, just as much as you caused me to pause. Now I'm pausing everywhere.
Right. I believe that starting in 87 with Greenspan, there was a conscious decision made to do two things. One was to use monetary policy specifically to try to eliminate the business cycle, or to at least really mitigate the business cycle. Two was to believe that it was possible to grow wealth faster than one could grow the economy. I'll say that again, to believe that it is possible to grow wealth more quickly than it is possible to grow the underlying economy. I don't think that either of those things are true, in fact, but I can understand from a political point of view why you would act as though they were true. Because to the degree you're able to use monetary policy to either smooth out economic cycles or to grow wealth faster than the underlying economy grows, that's wonderful for whatever incumbent politician or central banker is present when you're doing that. The big problem, of course, is at some point you do have to pay the piper, because I don't believe it is possible to eliminate business cycles with monetary policy. I don't believe it is possible to grow wealth faster than you can grow underlying economic activity. And that when the gulf between those things becomes too great, it becomes more and more likely that you can have an enormous decline in wealth as it goes back down to the level of underlying economic activity. And similarly, if that decline happens at the time where a business cycle has been propped up for too long, then you can get both economic activity, underlying activity collapsing, at the same time that wealth, which was even higher, comes down to whatever that new lower level. When I say that I think a hard rain's going to fall, when I say that I really sympathize with the views of people who want to protect themselves and their wealth, these circumstances, I really do. Because I really do believe that the Fed, starting with Greenspan, who frankly I think knew better, but he did it anyway. I think Bernanke was the real disaster in terms of Fed chiefs, because again, my view is he's a true believer. He really does believe that the high priests of the Fed can control the business cycle. He really believes all that. And then you've got the people who are left to pick up the pieces, which is first Yellen, who was just Bernanke Jr., and then you've got Powell, who's in a tough spot. Where does this leave us? Where it leaves us is I think that the Fed will, in fact, do whatever it takes to control inflation. The problem with that is that in the same way that taking rates down to zero did nothing to increase inflation, I don't think increasing rates until you get to like 3.5% on the Fed funds rate, I don't think it'll do anything to crimp or control inflation. I think inflation is well embedded in wages and prices, and I think it's going to require Fed funds rate of 4 or 5% before you're going to be able to break that. And that's going to lead to a nasty recession. I'm not optimistic about any of this, which is exactly why I think that sort of scenario, a stagflation scenario, I don't think it works for any Wall Street security. I really don't. And that's why I think you've got to the degree you can, and I think most people listening to the show can, because we're talking about personal finances, you have to invest in what you really know. There's rarely going to be any security. It's going to be in your home, your business, your family, and your neighbors. I think that is the answer, to find places where you can invest in what's real. What's real is something that has real cash flow, something that really makes a real object that is purchased by real people for doing real things. I think that's what one has to do in this sort of environment.
I think your analysis of the Fed, I don't see how people can disagree with that. It sure looks like something that we saw. It's kind of the way the dot-com bubble got popped. It was the way that also back in 08, 09, it was the same kind of thing. That raised rates, and then it looks like it'll probably be the same script. And again, this is just two guys talking, and we're not making any predictions about anything. It's just kind of like looking at the scenario. I guess there's the side of me, while I give you credit for being very persuasive on your case, there is the side of me that wonders, with inflation ticking up right now, and as you make the point, based on past behavior, they will probably do everything they can to stop it or to bring it down. But there's a side of me that says, when you listen to the persuasive case of some of the perhaps OG Bitcoin folks, it's kind of like, well, what if they get it wrong? What if it doesn't hit right? What if everything is not as able to be controlled like you described, which I can easily imagine being exactly what the plan is. I also concur with the idea that being a perma bear is tough on life.
It's tough on life.
It's tough on the mind. But on the flip side, I guess it would be for some folks that say, gosh, I've got my wealth here and I don't want to lose it, so to speak. So it's an interesting time to be alive. How's that for a hedge?
You live in interesting times. That's right. The old Chinese curse. Yes, that is absolutely right. We've covered the big stuff, Mike. We've covered the big stuff.
I wasn't sure how you were going to respond and whatnot. And I had a little bit of prep here to try and see both sides. I still see both sides to some degree. I think what I see and what you've laid out is people really need to think carefully about the kind of life they want to lead. What do they want? If they can imagine a worst case scenario, or they can imagine a best case scenario, but thinking of these scenarios, trying to imagine being comfortable, margin of safety mindset, you'll be okay if things don't go the best way that we can imagine.
If there are two things that I would love people to get out of this conversation, one of them is exactly that. To think about, how do you want to live your life? How do you protect yourself without falling into the very alluring story arc of rooting for decline, because you invest not so much of your money, but so much of your mind into this notion that the world's going to go to hell and I've got to cordon myself off. And it's so easy to become wrapped up into that grumpy grandpa mindset. And it's a mindset I understand. I've lived it. I still live it. And the challenge is to recognize it without giving yourself over to it as just another storyline or plot. That's issue number one that I'd like people to get out of this conversation. Issue number two is to recognize that the storytelling, the very effective storytelling that Wall Street does, is across everything that Wall Street does. Every security, everything that you are offered, that is offered to you to buy in the business of financial services, it's constructed around a story. It's a MacGuffin, and they want, frankly, the rubes to test out different stories until they find one that they like, and then they're just going to sell the shit out of it to you. Recognizing that that is the business of Wall Street, in exactly the same way that we recognize that the business of Hollywood is present an object of desire and then to create a script around it. Once you see that they're one and the same thing, it allows you not to be the sucker at the poker table. It doesn't mean you don't play poker. It means that you're not the sucker at the table, that you maintain a critical distance between Wall Street in yourself in the same way that I think that all of us can maintain a critical distance between Hollywood and ourselves. That's the big point.
As somebody who's been working on a script for the last 4 years, learning how to write one, actually, really, it's quite a process. And I have to say, the funny thing is when you start on a script, if you're a novice like I was, you think, well, I can just do this how I want to do it. I will just come in with my vision of no, 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 no. There is a formula, and that formula works. And you've got to follow that formula because that's what everyone does. And that's what everyone knows. There's no breaking the formula.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right, Mike.
Ben, where can we send people? What would you like to direct them to?
Epsilon Theory. So it's epsilontheory.com. It's at Epsilon Theory on Twitter. We got lots of stuff, lots of free stuff. We write about this. As you can tell, I love talking about this stuff. Come on over to the website or follow me on Twitter. Epsilon Theory.
I'm sure I'll get some feedback on this episode. I'll make sure to share with you. I'm sure I'll give you some writing grist, so to speak. Hey, Ben, great for coming on again. It's been a while, and we'll have to do this more often because I do enjoy your perspective, and I apologize for not reaching out sooner. The time just flies, 1,000+ episodes, and I don't know what's going on half the time, but there you go. Here we are. We're back, right? Okay.
Thank you, Mike. Really enjoyed it.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.